if you were to approach Trump and just say, you're violating human rights, he'd probably say, what are those? I don't care. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. If you went up to him and said, you're mistreating migrants, he would say, of course I am. This is the problem with trying to govern by law school hypothetical. That's a TV show. Is this slippery slope that becomes an enormous exception to the ban on torture. So it's why you don't legislate through law school hypotheticals. You focus on what happens in the real world. Trump is just breaching not only norms, but also laws that protect rights of Americans and people around the world. And he could care less. It's a way of pursuing his autocratic vision. Trump is very conscious of his public image. He's got a very fragile ego. That does give us leverage.
So, Ken, you spent 3 decades at the head of the Human Rights Watch. And before we talk about that experience itself, as well as some current events, I'm curious about what shaped you into the person who took that job. So you went to Brown and then Yale Law School, and I'm sure you could have had a great career on Wall Street, making lots of money, or in academia or something else. So why was it that human rights called to you?
Well, there's no simple answer to that, Robinson, but I think a big part of it was the experience of my father. He fled Nazi Germany as a 12-year-old boy in July 1938, and he came to New York. So I grew up with Hitler stories. I grew up with stories about what it was like for a young Jewish boy to be living under the Nazis, to worry about the brown shirt bullies at the playground, beating up on him, to worry about what the Nazis might do to my grandfather, his father, the threat of arresting him. And so this was sort of my introduction to the evil that governments can do. And I think, a big part of my motivation was a desire to prevent comparable atrocities from being replicated, obviously not just against Jews, but against anybody. So I think that was a big factor. The other thing, to be honest, is that I went to law school really wanting a career in public service. I didn't think I'd be happy just doing corporate law. And at that stage, Jimmy Carter had just introduced human rights as a new element of U.S. foreign policy. And I was interested in international work. I saw this as the new frontier, and I was very excited to be a part of it. So that was, a big part of it as well. Now, I have to say it was not the smartest decision at the time. I signed up for the one course on human rights that Yale Law School offered, and they canceled it. So I have no training. I've actually never taken a course in human rights in my life, although I now teach 2 at Princeton. And I went into a non-existent job market. When I graduated, Human Rights Watch had 2 employees. And so I actually spent the first 6-7 years of my legal career practicing as a lawyer, mainly as a federal prosecutor. And then nights and weekends volunteering, doing human rights work. I was very excited by it. And when a job opened up at Human Rights Watch, I jumped at it. It was the best political move, the best professional move I'd ever made. And I stuck with it pretty much until now. I left 3 years ago.
I entirely can understand how the story of your father and your family shaped you into wanting to get into human rights. I'm curious about your philosophical attitudes toward right and wrong, because I'm sure there are lots of very difficult decisions that have to be made where you have to determine what is right and what is wrong, or distinguish between the two. And I've been teaching ethics the last couple of quarters, so these questions are on my mind. And I wonder whether you have a theory of right and wrong that you ascribe to and follow in your work.
I do, although I have to say that I don't find, much of any discrepancy between the rights framework and my personal ethics. And so, I'm not a utilitarian. I don't believe that you can just sort of, sacrifice individuals because of some greater good. I really believe in the dignity and the importance of the individual human being. And that's the rights framework. It says that you can't sacrifice individuals for some greater good, that there are certain limits to what government can do. And obviously, there are variations on that. You can tax people differently. You can regulate them differently. But when you deal with the core issues, do they get to live? Can they be tortured? Are they, able to live freely without detention? Do they have basics such as food or healthcare or housing? These are things that are not supposed to be sacrificed for the greater good. And that parallels my belief. So I actually have been very comfortable within the rights framework.
I guess what I'm asking more is whether your firm belief in these foundations stems from maybe something like religious conviction, or it's just a very deep, inalienable feeling that you have.
It's for me, it's not real. I mean, I'm not a religious person. I was raised as a Jew. I was bar mitzvah. I went through kind of traditional Jewish education, but I'm not a believer in God. That's not really what motivates me. For me, it's much more just empathy with people. And I just, if I see somebody who is being severely mistreated, I am naturally outraged and naturally feel sympathy for that person. I want to do what I can to prevent that. So it's more instinctive. I'm not sure what you would call it, but I do believe in the individual, and that has to be, the rights of the individual have to be a limit on what government or the collective can do to people.
One of the reasons that I'm just curious about this is I don't know if you can see if it's picked up by the camera, but I'm being pestered by my pets, and I have this very deep instinctive feeling toward animals. And it doesn't matter to me whether or not there are like facts about what is right or what is wrong. Things like factory farming just outrage me, and I don't need any reason for it. That's enough to prompt my acting or speaking out against things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I have not moved that far. I mean, I've got a dog. I feel very close to the dog. I wouldn't mistreat the dog, but I'm not a vegetarian. So there's just kind of a limit to, I guess, my moral scope. And similarly with various political causes. Like, I mean, obviously, I'm worried about climate change. Or there are lots of things I worry about, but there's a limit to what you can do. And so I've decided to really focus my professional energies and time on the rights issue, which is huge. It's more than what I can handle. And just have to make arbitrary lines in terms of what you take on and what you don't.
One thing that I really want to make sure we talk about is the way that HRW works and the tactics that you have used over the last 3 decades. Before, though, we get into the general framework, in recent talks, you've emphasized that in advocacy, it can be important to focus on impact over purity. And I'm wondering if you have any examples where compromising on tactics, but not on the facts, moved a government to respect human rights more than a tactic you use like naming and shaming alone.
Well, I mean, maybe we should take a step back, Robertson, and just sort of set forth just briefly, what it is that Human Rights Watch does. Because
Please.
as I outline in the book, Righting Wrongs, there are 2 key tools that we use. One is to shame governments that violate human rights. And that is possible because in today's world, every government pretends to respect human rights. It's a basic matter of their legitimacy. And so if you can show that, in fact, they're not looking out for their people, they're not respecting rights, they're just looking out for themselves, that's embarrassing. It's delegitimizing and shameful. And governments go to great lengths to avoid the quite intense spotlight that Human Rights Watch was able to shine on that kind of misconduct. I mean, but when I left, it was 1,000 media mentions a day. So this is very delegitimizing. And governments at first would respond by, attacking us by saying we didn't understand, we were biased or whatever. But this kind of spin effort didn't work. We were very careful about the facts. And ultimately, they would recognize that they weren't going to get rid of the bad press until they changed the bad conduct. And that's how we began to make some progress. Now, the second tool that we would use is we would go to influential governments that purported to promote human rights in their foreign policies. And The premise to that work was that, every government, every dictatorship, every autocrat wants something from the international community. It could be arms sales, it could be, preferential trade benefits, it could be an invitation to some fancy summit, whatever it is. We would go to these potentially allied governments and say, would you deprive the target government of this thing that they want until they change? And that, could be very effective. And so the combination meant that we were hitting them in their reputation, also hitting them in their kind of economic and diplomatic interests. And that was a way to put very significant pressure on governments. We're not naive about governments. Governments violate human rights because it's very convenient. It's a way to stay in power. It's a way to get rid of the opposition. So our job was to change the cost-benefit analysis behind that repression, and to do that by, raising the cost of the repression. So that's, the essence of what we did. Now, your question, did we make tactical compromises? I mean, in a sense, yes, all the time, in that one thing we learned very early on is you don't go into, one of these allied governments with, kind of vague philosophical requests, stop torture, treat women better. It's just too vague. And so what you have to do is to sort of study them, really do research in advance and figure out, okay, what is on their agenda that we could nudge in a positive direction that would make a difference. And we would focus on these, kind of very concrete steps that were not necessarily a panacea, but would push the target government incrementally in the right direction. And so, that was just the pragmatism behind this kind of advocacy. Now, I give one example in the book where we actually compromised even on the goal a little bit. So this is our effort to secure a treaty banning child soldiers. And what we wanted, the Convention on the Rights of the Child defines childhood as anybody up until they turn 18. But there was an anomaly in that it allowed recruitment of children who were younger. And so we wanted to close off that anomaly and raise the standard to 18 for any soldier. And that was the absolute goal. It turned out that the US, which tends to be allergic to any treaty, was willing to join on, and they were willing to prohibit children in combat. They were willing to prohibit forced recruitment of children. But they wanted to be able to voluntarily recruit basically 17-year-olds, because that's when kids graduate from high school. And they wanted to be able to sort of sign them up then, even though they wouldn't deploy them in actual combat. And, we thought about it and figured, okay, that's not ideal, but to get the US on board rather than have the US, yet again oppose a global effort was worth it. And so we kind of signed off on that compromise. And that is, that's an example where you just have to be pragmatic. The end result was a strong treaty, that banned child soldiers around the world. It's broadly supported, and it had the support of the United States, which we wanted. But, we didn't get everything we wanted there.
So you mentioned these two tactics, so shaming and then going to influential governments to try to maybe put sanctions or somehow put the target country in a bad position. And the word I have in mind right now, compromise isn't the right word for this. I have in mind a case where these two tactics probably wouldn't work or aren't working. And the reason that this comes to mind, Russia, is just I've recently had a number of conversations with economists who have talked about how our sanctions on Russia with regard to oil, for instance, haven't been working because as a member of the BRICS, instead of selling oil to Europe, they'll just sell the oil to India or China, and maybe India and China will resell it or just use it themselves. And then Putin is somebody who seems to be utterly immune to bad press, at least outside of Russia. So I'm wondering how HRW tackles a case like this.
Well, in the book, I describe how, while, most human rights abuses are shameful in the eyes of the public of a country, there are exceptions. And, the one I described, for example, is Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. If you went up to him and said, you're mistreating migrants, he would say, of course I am. That's my political platform. That's how I won the last election.
Right.
And so while that kind of abuse is actually shameful within Hungarian cities, it's not shameful in the countryside, which is where Orban's base is. Now, ironically, he faces actually a very significant electoral threat today. So his majority is very much in jeopardy from a charismatic opponent, this guy, Peter Magyar. But at the time when we were addressing this, a frontal approach of just shaming him for his mistreatment of migrants wasn't going to get us anyplace. And so in that case, we had to say, well, what else can we use? And as I describe in the book, we focused on the European Union, on Brussels, because his mistreatment of migrants was shameful in Brussels. And Orban depended on billions of euros in subsidies from the European Union every year. And after a big fight, we were able to persuade the European Union to condition those subsidies on an end to what they call violations of the rule of law. And so that was an example where kind of an indirect shaming process coupled with this sort of economic pressure was successful. I describe another issue in the book where we were looking at in Egypt under the Mubarak government, the Cairo police were basically soliciting on the internet and trapping and then torturing gay men. And this was something that, because LGBT rights were so frowned upon within Egypt, a frontal approach wasn't going to be very effective. It wasn't necessarily going to lead to shame. But what was shameful within Egypt was the idea of torture. And so we presented the torture of gays in conjunction with the torture of dissidents and the torture of Islamists. And that was kind of a more palatable way to address it. But we also went to the US government where LGBT rights were much more popular. And we're able to get a bunch of members of Congress to write a letter to Mubarak saying this got to stop. And the US was a huge supplier of military aid to Egypt. They had to listen. And the combination ended the practice. It basically ended completely. It picked up a little bit over the years, but it was essentially over with. And so we were able to pursue, kind of an indirect route of shaming that proved, successful. So these are the kinds of strategic things one has to go through. Now, in a case like Russia today, I think up until Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, he still was susceptible to shaming. I describe in the book how we were able to stop the bombing of civilians in northwestern Syria and Idlib province, basically by putting pressure on Putin, by working through, Macron, the French president, Merkel, the German chancellor, and Erdogan, the Turkish president, to get them to pressure Putin to stop because he cared about his relations with Europe. Now, obviously, since the full-scale invasion of the Ukraine, that kind of shaming isn't possible. But and in a sense, everything has been thrown at him. Not only a bunch of sanctions, but also, huge military support for Ukraine.
If Pins the Podcat or Mishka the Vishla didn't give it away, I have a very, very soft spot for animals. Episode number 209 with Peter Singer was the conversation that really pushed me over the edge to take factory farming and animal product consumption seriously. And then episode number 233 with the neuroscientist Michael Graziano about animal consciousness cemented my opposition to factory farming. Enter FarmKind, which is a nonprofit dedicated to ameliorating the harm caused by factory farming. Apparently, over 99% of farmed animals in the United States are raised on factory farms. And if you've ever sought out a video, or in my case, been forced to listen to Peter Singer describe these conditions, then you know just how deplorable they are. FarmKind researches and vets charities to protect factory farmed animals. They don't take a cut of your money, and just a small donation can help tens, if not hundreds or thousands of animals. I have personally donated money to FarmKind, and if you'd like to, there's a link in the description. Using the code Robertson, we'll give your donation a 50% boost from pledges by larger donors.
And at this point where, his invasion is really an existential crisis for him, if he's seen as, having wasted all of these Russian lives, having, kind of courted disaster for just, his personal reasons, he could be overthrown very quickly. And in those circumstances, it's almost as if anything goes. And so the only thing one can do is to continue to ratchet up the pressure. And so, today, our strategy is really to focus on Trump and get Trump to stop his instinctive um, alliance with Putin, and to recognize that Putin is the obstacle for a just peace in Ukraine, and to live up to his vow of so-called severe consequences if Putin continues to obstruct a ceasefire there. So, you have to change the tactics. And there are people, like Putin or like Assad in Syria until his overthrow, who are so awful that they do become shameless. But that's really rare. Most leaders do pretend to respect the rights of their people and can be affected through shame.
It's interesting that Trump is your main, or is a major mechanism for getting at Putin these days. And Trump is an interesting character in many, many ways. But what I have in mind here is he is simultaneously, my understanding, extremely conscious of the media. And people say that he spends hours and hours watching TV every day. But at the same time, he also seems very immune to public shaming. Maybe it's kind of like with Orban, where what he's being shamed for are things that his base supports him for. But how are you? Maybe you're not doing this right now since you're not at the head of the HRW, but what does trying to shame him for his instinctive alliances with Putin look like? Trying to change that behavior?
Well, I mean, this is something I'm very actively involved with. In fact, just yesterday, I had a piece in The Guardian about what it would take to have a fair peace in Ukraine. So I'm very involved in pushing this. And I think, as you note, that, I mean, if you were to approach Trump and just say, you're violating human rights, he'd probably say, what are those? I don't care. So, a frontal approach doesn't work. But, as you know, Trump is very conscious of his public image. He's got a very fragile ego. And that does give us leverage. So I think the best approach with Trump, if you sort of say, well, what does he care about? He thinks of himself as this incredibly savvy negotiator, the art of the deal. And if we can persuade him through the media that he will be looked at as naive if he succumbs to, whether it's, Putin's bamboozling or Netanyahu's efforts in Gaza, that, unless he takes his firmer stand, which in essence would be a pro-human rights stand, he is going to be looking like, a weak, unsophisticated negotiator. And that's anathema to him. He hates that idea. And so that gives us leverage. I think it's great that Trump wants a Nobel Peace Prize. Go for it. But that means, you don't get a Nobel Peace Prize by, signing away Ukraine's democracy. You don't get a Nobel Peace Prize by underwriting the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. You get a Nobel Peace Prize by doing the right thing. And so these are, ways to go after Trump, who remains incredibly influential in the case of Ukraine because, the U.S. security guarantees for the proposed European reassurance force in Ukraine, the ongoing supply by the United States of weapons to the Ukrainian army are essential to prevent Ukraine from just crumbling, from Putin being able to take over. Similarly in Gaza, the entire world has turned on Netanyahu now. It's Trump's willingness to continue the $3 billion in annual military aid to Israel, the endless supply of arms. That's what keeps the genocide going in Gaza. So if Trump is to use that leverage in either situation, he can make a big difference.
You said a lot just now, but what jumped out at me, or what I stuck on a little bit, was your comment about Trump seeing himself as like a master negotiator, and your recognition that this is the chink in the armor that needs to be targeted. And what I am wondering is, you said that the one human rights course that you wanted to take at Yale was canceled, unfortunately. But I'm wondering what other ways legal education might have really prepared you for the work that you're doing today and have been doing, just because it seems like very much analysis of weaknesses, capitalizing on them. It might not be directly crafting an argument about Trump being a bad negotiator, but it's somehow exploiting this fact to shift opinion.
I mean, I think that's correct. The I mean, in law school, when they teach human rights, they tend to teach, okay, these are the treaties and these are the mechanisms that enforce the treaties. It's pretty dry. You can learn that on the job. It's not essential. I picked it up as I went. What they don't teach is how you strategize, how you figure out where your leverage is and how you can effectively put pressure on a target. It's actually hard for any school to teach that. I mean, I teach a course at Princeton on this, but there are very few courses like this. And the aim in each case is, and this is really the point of my book, is to show that there's always an angle. That if you analyze the situation, there's always, a point of vulnerability, a weakness that can be exploited. And you've got to figure that out and figure out, which tools you have, which comes with experience. It's something that I learned, very much on the job. But that's an advantage of having done this for a long time, is that I do have some experience now. I know what has worked. And what I do in the book is actually give a bunch of examples of what has worked, but also what doesn't work, to try to illustrate the kind of possibilities that are there for similar human rights work, or for that matter, work in other fields. Because this idea of pressuring a government or an institution is by no means limited to human rights. It can be used in any situation where there are moral frameworks that guide what an institution is supposed to be doing.
I don't think either of us has mentioned the title of your book, Righting Wrongs, but there will be, of course, and our audience will know this, links in the description. I would like to talk about maybe some paradigmatic cases where, since you go through all of these examples in the book, where these two major tactics have worked in just like perfect clear-cut cases, and then cases where they haven't worked at all.
Okay, I mean, obviously the book is filled with these. One example that I get into in the book involved Libya under Gaddafi. And this was a situation where he wanted things from the international community. He was facing a range of sanctions because of his support for terrorism, because of his nuclear program. And he was trying to clean up his act, address a lot of those things. And the one real scar on his reputation that he was not addressing yet was his human rights record. He was super repressive. And so we, working through his son, were able to persuade him to let us visit Libyan prisons and speak freely with political prisoners. And the one condition was that we would go to Tripoli and present our findings before publishing them. So I went to Tripoli and I met with, a bunch of officials. And the initial day we presented the findings, and they pretended, at least, to be furious. They just yelled at us. You completely misunderstood. You got it all wrong. And I let them go on for a little bit. And then finally said, look, guys, you don't really understand. We are going to be releasing these findings at a press conference in Cairo in a few days. The journalists are going to ask us, how were your conversations in Tripoli? And I could say, they were terrible. All they did was yell at us. Or I can say they were constructive and we discussed reforms. Which should it be? That shut them up. They said, we've got to consult with our superiors. They sent us home for the night. Next morning, we got a phone call. We went back in. It was like a new government. There were piles of folders on the desk of all the political prisoner cases we were interested in. They were very welcoming. And we identified something like 171 political prisoners, and very quickly they were all released. And it showed that, here we had them where we needed them. They wanted to improve their reputation. We were the obstacle to that. They were not going to change. We were not going to change our opinion until they changed their practice. And so that was an example, where it worked. Now, other times it's more complicated. I mean, I give this story in the book about Rwanda's support for the M23 rebel group in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. And this was an incredibly brutal group that, rapes and kills civilians. And Human Rights Watch has an office in Goma in Eastern Congo. And we began documenting the Rwandan military support for the M23. And we put out one report, and Paul Kagame, the Rwandan president, just denied it. He said, we misunderstood. So, a few months later, we put out another report, and he denied it again. And by the third report, all the diplomats understood that we were telling the truth, that we had the goods on this, and that Kagame was lying through his teeth. And we were able to get, at that stage, John Kerry, who was the US Secretary of State, and William Hague, who was the British Foreign Secretary, to call Kagame and say, we're going to cut off your aid unless you stop supporting the M23. And within days, literally, the M23 crumbled and disappeared. And so that was the good news. For 8 years, the people of Eastern Congo were not being preyed upon by this awful rebel group. Today, the M23 is back. And what has happened is that Kagame has spent the intervening years trying to make himself indispensable. So his peacekeepers are playing an important role in northern Mozambique. He hosts conferences in Rwanda. He does PR efforts like Visit Rwanda that are on the arms of the Arsenal football team, soccer team. He has offered to take asylum seekers from Britain, from the United States. And all of this is designed to dissuade the Western donors from further conditioning their aid. And so this is, a renewed problem. Now, Trump has come in and, signed a deal that supposedly ended the conflict, but it hasn't ended the conflict. All he cares about is mining the minerals. He's not that concerned about the M23 withdrawing. And so, we're in a bad situation again. So, what's the lesson from this? It's good that we were able to stop things for 8 years. We didn't stop it permanently. And one lesson I try to give in the book is that, governments are always tempted to violate human rights. It's the need to push back is incessant. You can't just, win one and go home and say your job's done. You got to keep the pressure up. And so one thing you have to recognize if you get into the human rights field is that there's always the need to sustain the pressure. And, you may win today, but you're going to lose tomorrow, and then you'll win the next day. So there's this ongoing battle. And I think the Eastern Congo situation illustrates that well.
Why are governments always tempted to violate human rights?
Because it's a way to get things that they want. I mean, often it's just a matter of staying in power. In the case of, Kagame, the Rwandan president of Eastern Congo, he wants the mineral wealth the Eastern Congo has. Rwanda doesn't have that. Across the border, it's there. It's very tempting. He just invades. Congo is a bit chaotic. He can get away with it. He just does it. So whether it's wealth or power or some combination, these are temptations for leaders that they succumb to unless there's pressure that they respect human rights.
It is just fascinating and somewhat depressing to think that governments are by their nature like immoral or ruthless in some way, and you can always depend on this.
Well, I mean, look, obviously a lot depends on the character of the leader. And so it's not, every leader that ignores human rights, but I think it's a temptation that's always there. And we're seeing this in Trump. Trump is just breaching not only norms, but also laws that protect rights of Americans and people around the world. And he could care less, as a way of pursuing his autocratic vision. So, it shows that even in a country like the United States with a strong democratic tradition, it's not immune to these kind of temptations. Or you can go back to, the George W. Bush administration. I discussed this at length in the book, where, at that time, in the name of national security, in the name of fighting al-Qaeda, which had just, conducted the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. just ripped up the rules on warfare and counterinsurgency and began torturing people systematically and throwing them without trial forever in Guantanamo. And so, I think we have to recognize that even within the United States, this temptation to violate human rights is very much there. And of course, you see this around the world as well. That's why you need a human rights movement to push back, to make that kind of succumbing to that temptation more costly.
Speaking of like the Guantanamo situation, I took one political philosophy class many, many years ago in undergraduate. So I am probably very wrong here on some level, but I recall, I don't know if it was Hobbes, I think it was Hobbes maybe, who justified, at least on some level, the state being able to act outside of the law, and in this case, perhaps violate human rights, because people or its enemies are also violating outside of the law. And in order to compete with them, some laws need to be violated. And I did find this compelling in the sense that we can come up with a thought experiment where you have a criminal who knows the location of the nuclear bomb in New York City, and we can only get it by torturing him. Is it worth violating human rights to save millions and millions of lives? And I'm wondering if you just view human rights as being entirely inviolable.
Well, let me first use your torture example and then also talk about war. Um, the torture example you give is actually what proponents of torture, they always cite that example. It's the ticking time bomb example. And I describe in the book how that rationale was used by Israel in an earlier era, um, to necessitate, you know, torturing somebody because there is this ticking time bomb that's about to go off. And that was the original rationale. But what quickly happens is it becomes a very expansive metaphor, because if you're going to torture somebody for the time bomb that's ticking, why can't you torture them for a bomb that's going to be placed tomorrow? Or why can't you torture them because they could, locate somebody who might know where the bomb is going to be placed next month? I mean, aren't all these people's lives worth saving? And what you quickly find out, what Israel found out, was that the ban on torture, which is an absolute prohibition that every government has signed on to, it's jettisoned, it's thrown out the window, because this, supposedly narrow exception swallows the entire rule. And so there is something called the Landau Commission, which actually said this has got to stop. This rationale doesn't work. Now, Israel has, fallen back on torture now. That's among the things that it's doing in fighting the war in Gaza. But there is a universal view that the ban on torture is absolute. And you can't, come up with these law school hypotheticals to justify exceptions to it. Now, the other, factor worth considering here is that, even in time of war, that is to say, even when somebody is attacking your country, bombing it, invading it, whatever, there are clear rules about what cannot be done. Those are the Geneva Conventions and the protocols. It's known as international humanitarian law. And every single government has signed on to these. And the point is to say that, yes, you may be at war. This may be, the worst kind of national security threat you're ever going to face, but there's certain things you can't do. You can't deliberately attack civilians. You can't indiscriminately bomb civilian neighborhoods. You can't starve civilians. Basic rules, pretty intuitive, but governments all subscribe to those rules. Now, do they violate them? I mean, yes, Israel, which also subscribes to those rules, is flouting them left and right in Gaza. It is indiscriminately bombing neighborhoods. It's starving civilians. It is shooting people who are coming up to get food. So, these are severe violations, but nobody's questioning the norms. I mean, you don't even see Israel saying it's okay to shoot people who are, seeking food. They always try to justify it with some, vague excuse. So I think it's important to recognize that, this Hobbesian view that you can do anything you want because the world's an ugly place out there is not the moral standard governing the world today, as illustrated by these treaties like the Geneva Conventions that every government has accepted. Every military has signed on to them. And these are not rules that, human rights groups have concocted. These are rules written by the major militaries of the world to govern themselves in time of war.
I understand that these are laws that all of these countries have signed on to, and it is a good thing that they have signed on to these laws. But still, in this most terrible ticking time bomb case, wouldn't we want our governments to violate human rights? And of course, we're assuming that our government is like this perfect actor, and in this case, they have perfect knowledge. They know that this bomb is there, that it is going to go off, and we're just hoping that it doesn't become a slippery slope. We don't want to give them tacit permission to violate the conventions whenever they want to, but when it's really clear that New York City is on the line.
Yeah. I mean, this is the problem with trying to govern by law school hypothetical. The ticking time bomb thing just never happens in real life. Yeah, that's a TV show. And instead what you get are these metaphorical allusions to it where, okay, there might be a ticking bomb tomorrow, or this terrorist threat is posing something down the road, and therefore we need to torture people to prevent that. I mean, it is this slippery slope that becomes an enormous exception to the ban on torture. So it's why you don't legislate through law school hypotheticals. You focus on what happens in the real world. And it's absolutely clear you don't want to open the door even a crack to permitting torture.
I accept that. I mean, it makes sense to me. I understand the huge danger in practice. Earlier, you mentioned that one of the crucial things that law school doesn't teach you for operating in the real world is strategizing. And HRW has to do so many things beyond just strategizing. There's also the fact finding and the analysis that comes before it, and the publicity that comes afterward. And this operation is huge. I mean, spanning investigations across the globe. I'm wondering if we can talk a bit about just the logistics of how it's put together and what are these very many different tasks that are going on in the organization at any given time.
Okay. Well, and maybe starting with the law school example. I mean, law school tends to just, teach you what the law is. What it doesn't teach very well, at least, is the importance of facts. And I learned the importance of facts in my first few years of practice. Initially for a judge I worked for who really, believed that the facts dictate what's right and wrong, and the law provides broad guidance, but it's really the facts that tell you what to do. And then, in my stint in private practice, very briefly, in my longer time as a prosecutor, I saw the power of facts, that it's facts that move people. And if, once you describe a situation, if people don't think it's wrong, citing some law is not going to change their mind. So this public sense of right and wrong is critical to generating pressure on governments to behave better. Now, Human Rights Watch does that. In fact, I mean, the work of Human Rights Watch really begins with investigations in the field. We have people we call researchers who operate in about 100 countries around the world. And these are people who, could be lawyers, they could be journalists, they could be academics. I mean, they have a bunch of different backgrounds. Their job is, if they aren't already, then to become one of the world's leading experts on human rights in their country or on their issue. And they do this by, conducting very detailed investigations on the ground. They go to the site of the crime. They speak to the victims, to the eyewitnesses, to the government, anybody who has firsthand information. They collect physical evidence, they take photographs. And what they do is they put together an irrefutable account of what happened. And that is published. So that is really the foundation for the work of Human Rights Watch. That publication is what leads to the media attention that shames governments. That publication is what persuades influential governments to use their clout on behalf of the human rights cause. So, it is that investigative and reporting work that is the heart of Human Rights Watch. Then once a publication is out, we have teams that try to put it into the media that operate in different capitals around the world to try to enlist influential governments on our behalf. So that's the essence of Human Rights Watch.
These journalists, academics, and lawyers, are they your researchers? Are they volunteers largely?
Oh, no. This is a staff. I mean, we have, when I left, the staff was about 550 people. The annual budget was 100 million US. And no, you need full-time staff, because this is a full-time job. To really become, one of the world's experts on an issue, and then to have the time to, do the investigation, to publicize your findings, to generate pressure on the target government to change. That's more than a full-time job. I mean, these are very intense jobs. So, no, you can't do that as a volunteer. It's not something you dabble in. And indeed, one thing that really motivated me as a fundraiser was that I recognized that if I could raise the money to hire another researcher, I was, hiring the capacity to enlist this expertise, to enlist this information as a way to force governments to behave better. So it was a huge incentive for me to fundraise. But that's what it's about. You need a professional staff, because this is a very sophisticated endeavor.
If these people had been volunteers, and it makes tons of sense why they aren't, this would have strengthened the question I'm about to ask much more. But obviously, the objectivity of this fact-generating research is extremely important, because if it gets out that your stories are twisted, they're not real, that really undermines your credibility. And if these people were volunteers, you would assume that, okay, they're very strongly biased toward making a difference and finding and reporting on human rights violations, even if maybe things aren't as bad as are being reported. And I'm just wondering how it is that you maintain objectivity in the investigations.
So that's a very good question. And I mean, I should say, whether volunteer or professional, I mean, people want to work for Human Rights Watch. When we had an opening for a researcher, we get, 300 applications, we get incredibly exceptional candidates. We could really pick who we wanted. And so step one in answering your question is in the hiring process. We look for people who have the capacity to maintain objectivity, even in very partisan circumstances, even in the midst of a war or, a huge political conflict. And so that's a temperament we look for. We then train them. They don't just go off in the field on their own. They go off with more experienced researchers. They're taught how to do these investigations and how rigorous they have to be, how they have to look at all sides. And we then don't just publish the findings. We have a whole review process internally before anything goes out. And so things are scrutinized for accuracy, for objectivity, for appropriate use of international law, adherence to Human Rights Watch's policies. And so, by the end of this process, you can be pretty sure that what we publish is right. And, the testament to that, I suppose, is that we've never had to withdraw any major finding. Like any newspaper, we make, minor errors here and there and have to issue corrections, but nothing major. And that speaks to really the professionalism and integrity of the research staff.
As this war in Israel and Gaza has gone on, maybe it's echo chambers I'm in, but I've been seeing less and less, I'd say, debate over what's happening there than I was at the beginning of the war. And in the beginning, I was hearing lots of claims to the effect that, oh, things aren't nearly as bad as they appear. Israel's really like warning all of the Gazans before it drops bombs. And I don't think that that's as much the case now, but I do still see, maybe it's because it's on Twitter, lots of people will post clips of starving children and they'll say, but how come this child isn't starved? This is the only famine in history that selectively like starves children and not parents. And what I'm wondering though, more broadly, when you're dealing with cases like this, when governments block access, like battlefield zones, for instance, in this case, and how is it that you verify and make sure that you're getting really good data in these places? Like, are you using satellites, supply chain data, interviews with people who are escaping? What are the tools in the toolkit?
Yeah, I mean, this comes up all the time because governments, always try to block access. And sometimes it's too dangerous to go too. That's the other factor. And in those situations, you have to do remote investigations. But there are tried and true methods to do that. I mean, some of them are pretty straightforward because, the key is to speak to eyewitnesses. So ideally, you go to the scene of the crime, but if that's not possible, you can talk to people who have left, recent refugees. You can call people on the phone or WhatsApp or whatever, you can talk to people who are on the ground who can do, some investigations. Human Rights Watch has a partnership with something called Planet Labs in San Francisco, which sends up these microsatellites and takes a picture of the entire world every single day. And so we can call them and say, give us, the images for this particular location for the last 5 days and get them. There's something called open source analysis where people post visuals on social media, which you can scrape. You have to verify all of that, because it can be concocted. You match it against satellite imagery and the like. But there, are ways that becomes evidence too, if you can verify it. So there are a bunch of tools that can be used. Human Rights Watch does have one advantage in that we don't have to publish if we don't know. So if there's uncertainty, we just don't publish, and we wait until we know. And so, there are various tools, but a physical lack of access, it makes it more difficult, but it's not an impediment ultimately to reporting.
How have you of late in HRW been handling the case of famine and starvation in Gaza, investigating it, reporting on it, using it as a publicity point?
Yeah. I mean, look, at this point, obviously I'm not running Human Rights Watch anymore, so I can speak more for myself. But, I think that, although Netanyahu continues to deny that there's starvation, um, it's pretty obvious that there is, and you see this just from, the humanitarian workers who are in Gaza who are reporting it. We're speaking today when the leading UN agency just formally declared a famine in Gaza City and surrounding areas. It's uncontested that the Israeli government blocked any food from getting in for 11 weeks starting in March. Since then, has allowed in really drips and drabs of aid, these expensive, ineffectual, dangerous airdrops that, get little bits of food to people who are, strong enough to get there. These handful of points set up by the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, where hundreds of Palestinians have been shot and killed by showing up. All of this in lieu of the UN delivery system that was bringing food to people where they were living and was very effective. But Netanyahu stopped that. So I think that the basics are actually no longer contested. This is, clearly a starvation strategy. This is what the International Criminal Court charged both Netanyahu and the former Defense Minister Gallant with the war crime of starving Palestinian civilians. It is a key element of the, I think, quite appropriate charge of genocide today. And so I don't think, the facts are really contested anymore, even though there still is denial by the Israeli government.
There still is denial by the Israeli government, by Netanyahu. And you used Viktor Orban as an earlier example of somebody who he's not going to be shamed about mistreating migrants because for him, that's his platform. But I don't think Netanyahu's platform is let's starve the Gazans. What is the tactic that you take to shame somebody like this?
But the difficulty with Netanyahu is that his primary concern is staying in power and avoiding these pending corruption charges against him. And to do that, he needs to placate the two far-right ministers of his government, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who have been very open about their goal here, which is to ethnically cleanse Gaza. And that's the main point of what's going on today. There's talk about, pressuring Hamas for a better deal, but you're not allowed to starve civilians to pressure Hamas, just like you're not allowed to kill civilians to pressure Hamas. Those are war crimes. What I think is really going on here is simply an effort to, kill enough Palestinians, but more to the point, create conditions that are so unconducive to life that in the end, Palestinians feel they have no choice but to leave. And this will be a one-way ticket. It'll be another Nakba. They'll leave and they'll never be let back. And that is the, at this point, stated goal of these far-right ministers. And since Trump talked about creating a Gaza Riviera, it's the stated goal of Netanyahu too. So that's what's happening here. And I think that the fight against Hamas, which is, it's been decimated at this stage. I mean, there still is a Hamas there, but, does it really pose a threat to Israel? I mean, nothing compared to what Israel is doing to Gaza. And I think this is an effort to, ultimately remove 2 million Palestinians from the demographic balance sheet between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. And if they get away with that in Gaza, they will then move to the West Bank, where already there is, ethnic cleansing of so-called Area C, the 60% of the West Bank where all the settlements are. And I think over time we would see ethnic cleansing of other regions as well, all with the aim of solving, if that's the term, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by getting rid of the Palestinians. And, this is, the government is, the Israeli government is openly talking about this now. Just send them to South Sudan. This would be a massive crime against humanity. It'd be utterly wrong, but they're doing it because they're getting away with it. And even though they've totally lost the battle for global public opinion, there is only one person's opinion they care about anymore, and that is Trump. Because Trump is the guy who can turn on or off the U.S. military aid and the arms sales that enabled this genocide to go forward. And so this is a battle for Trump's conscience. And it is, it is a real battle, because even though Trump presumptively gives a green light to anything the Israeli government wants to do, he has been slowly distancing himself from Netanyahu. And you can see this in a series of decisions he's made in the Middle East in the several months that he's been president. He lifted sanctions against the Syrian government when Netanyahu preferred chaos in Syria. He negotiated directly with Hamas and with Iran when that was anathema. He cut a deal with the Houthis that involved an end to attacks on shipping, but not an end to attacks on Israel. He has twice forced Netanyahu to agree to temporary ceasefires. He has repudiated Netanyahu's false denial that starvation has taken place. So in a number of ways, Trump has just had it with Netanyahu. I think there's no love lost between the two. But for the time being, he's keeping the arms and the military aid flowing. Trump claims to be, moved by the starvation of the Palestinian civilians. He hasn't acted on that yet. But I don't think it's out of the question that he would, particularly as even U.S. public opinion is shifting. Predictably Democrats, but even Republicans and even MAGA Republicans are beginning to be outraged by what the Israeli government is doing. And, Trump, who foremost is concerned about himself, can turn on Israel at some stage. And so I think it is foreseeable that that will happen. I just hope it happens sooner rather than later, because this is a matter of lives being lost every single day.
I've just pulled up your article from July 2025. Why the reluctance to recognize Israel's genocide in Gaza. And I'm just looking at this first picture of a woman, looks like she's crying over a dead child. And it does seem like it's a very, very little time remaining. I last interviewed Norman Finkelstein about this in March or so, and the sort of tagline that he said a number of times was, there's nothing left of Gaza. It's just like rubble now. And is the hope then that you can, or those who are putting pressure on Trump can do so just like very soon? Because I don't see how or what there is left for this conflict. There's just, Gaza just really isn't there.
No, Gaza has been physically destroyed. The vast majority of people are living in tents. So if the conflict ends, there will be a huge rebuilding that is required, which it's conceivable the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Qataris would help to pay for, but only on the condition that it be part of a movement toward a Palestinian state. They're not going to just rebuild so Netanyahu can bomb it again. And this is, something that Netanyahu has spent his entire political career opposing. So this too is an area where Trump is going to have to exert his pressure. And if Trump wants an Abraham Accord that includes the Saudis, if he wants really to end this conflict, it's not going to be enough just to get a ceasefire. That would just, maintain a horrible situation. If he really wants to move forward, he's going to have to start making progress on a Palestinian state. This, again, is not Trump's instinct, but, Trump's primary concern is himself. And if he realizes that if he wants the accolades for really solving this problem, it's going to have to be through a Palestinian state. It's not going to be through ethnic cleansing. It's not going to be through unveiling apartheid. It's going to be through, finally giving Palestinians a state that they deserve.
You mentioned a few minutes ago, I didn't catch the names, but these two leading politicians for the far-right parties that Netanyahu is beholden to.
Ben Gvir and Smotrich, yes.
Yes. Openly called for ethnic cleansing in Gaza. I know you don't have the quotes in front of you, but do you recall what their language is like?
Well, they talk about voluntary departure. They're smart enough to know they don't talk about forced deportation. They talk about voluntary departure.
And they're not talking about genocide.
No, they don't.
Open.
They don't use the term genocide. No, but what they basically are saying is, implicitly, let's make things so awful that people voluntarily leave. And Netanyahu has adopted the same language since Trump began talking about a Gaza Riviera, where he too talked about no more Palestinians. Now, Trump has given up that language. Netanyahu has continued it. So, do they use the term genocide? No, they deny that they're committing genocide. They do talk openly about their aim being so-called voluntary dislocation. And the entire practice of this starvation is aimed at creating those conditions where Palestinians feel they have no choice but to flee.
Who is it that this article is directed toward that you think is most problematically not accepting that this is genocide?
Well, in the article, what I explained is that the public conception of genocide is very much colored by the Holocaust and to some extent by the Rwandan genocide. And those are both cases where at a certain point, the aim became, for the Nazis to kill every Jew they could find, for the Hutu extremists in Rwanda to kill every Tutsi they could find. These were genocides aimed at destroying a group in whole, to use the terminology of the Genocide Convention. But the Genocide Convention also defines genocide as being an intent to destroy a group in part, either through killing or through creating conditions unsuitable to life or other things as well. And I said that that's really the way to understand the genocide in Gaza. It is genocide not as the end, but genocide as a means for forced deportation. And the analogy I use, just to take it out of the Gaza situation for a moment, is what the Myanmar army did with the Rohingya, where they went in 2017 and killed roughly 10,000 Rohingya with the aim of forcing 730,000 Rohingya to flee to Bangladesh. So this was genocide for the ends of ethnic cleansing. It was genocide as a means. Now, that's not typically how people think about genocide, because they think about it as intending to destroy a group in whole, but that's not what the treaty says. The one practical difficulty is that the International Court of Justice, I think also influenced by this Holocaust view of the genocide, of what genocide is, has said that if you need to infer intent from conduct, that you can only infer genocidal intent if that's the only inference that is possible, which doesn't actually make sense when genocide is used as a means, because almost by definition, there's an alternative intent, the intent to ethnically cleanse. And they made this ruling in a case of Croatia versus Serbia, over a decade ago. And I think that they are going to need to revisit that. Initially, it will be in the Myanmar case because that's coming before them first, but then in the Gaza case. And I think the fair interpretation would be that there could be dual intent, that as long as you prove the intent to destroy a group adequately, you can demonstrate genocide even if genocide is for another purpose, even if there's an intent to commit another crime with the genocide. So that's, what I argued in the Guardian piece is the way that we should understand what's going on in Gaza, but that's also the jurisprudential shift that the International Court of Justice will have to make.
I think this has been a very important segment of the conversation, because that is the counter argument to genocide that I think I hear most often. It's not meant to be an extermination as an end in itself, the way that maybe the Holocaust was. It's just trying to get Gazans to flee. They just don't want them there anymore. And this means it's not genocide.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the counter argument, but it's really kind of begs the question of, well, what means are being used? And if the means used intend to destroy, a significant part of the Palestinian civilian population, either by indiscriminately bombing them or targeting them, or, by starving enough of them, that can be genocide as a means, even though it is serving another criminal purpose of forced deportation. And it would be ironic, frankly, if the International Court of Justice were to say that, a huge war crime, a crime against humanity of forced deportation, is a defense to genocide. And it doesn't even make sense. But that is what their current jurisprudence suggests, which is why I think they have to change that you can have, forced deportation being a motive for genocide. It shouldn't be a defense to genocide.
I'd like to make sure that we cover a few scattered topics, just some questions that I wanted to ask. One brings us closer to the United States, closer to home. What are the current biggest human rights violations that the United States is a party to? if not that it's directly causing, but at least contributing to?
Well, I mean, obviously the big one is the one we've been discussing, where they're aiding and abetting genocide in Gaza. So that's a big one. Um, the I mean, in terms of domestic policy, Human Rights Watch spent a lot of its time, and I describe this in the book, looking at especially racial discrimination that infected the criminal justice system. And the reason Human Rights Watch felt that we had a role to play there is because, while any individual criminal suspect could reasonably expect a fair trial, it's difficult for any single defendant to raise systematic issues. And you really needed the kind of investigative and reporting methodology of Human Rights Watch to demonstrate the patterns of discrimination that may exist in the deployment of police or in decisions about charges by prosecutors, decisions about setting bail, things of that sort that Human Rights Watch spent a lot of time on. So those that discriminatory angle of the criminal justice system is something that affects many, many people. I mean, today what everybody is focused on is immigration, and here I think the law is behind people's moral judgments. In that, I think it's fair for Trump to come in and say, "I have a mandate to reinforce the U.S.-Mexican border." I don't think there's been a lot of pushback as he tries to do that. He is ripping up the right to seek asylum, which is illegal. But the idea that, Americans don't want, migrants just freely floating across the border, I think is kind of where the public is today. But the public is not in favor of these random ICE raids that are taking place in neighborhoods and workplaces where it is presumed that undocumented migrants live. And the reason is that, although Trump talks about all these migrants being criminals and violent rapists and the like, in fact, the people being picked up are completely law-abiding in every way but their lack of legal papers to be in the United States. These typically are people who have U.S. citizen spouses, U.S. citizen children. They have jobs, they pay taxes, they're members of the community. They really are Americans in all but legal status. And there, I think, is a broad public distaste at the random roundup of these people and the deportation of them. And I think where the law has to go, it hasn't taken the step yet, is that we need to develop something like a statute of limitations for deportation. If you think about it in the criminal realm, most crimes, if you're not charged within 5 years, the government forgets it. You can't be prosecuted after that. That's what the statute of limitations says. Essentially, there's this assumption you can be able to get on with your life. We're not going to hold you responsible for something that happened a long time ago. In the realm of deportation, though, a statute of limitations doesn't exist. And I think it should, particularly because the longer people are in the United States, the more they build lives here, the more there are equities attached with their remaining in the United States. And that should weigh against the U.S. government's legitimate interest in controlling who becomes a lawful American resident. And so I think there is a need to introduce this concept of a statute of limitations. Sadly, the U.S. Congress is so stymied by partisan jockeying that, it's been impossible to get legislation through. But this could be done in a sense, even just through presidential de facto policy. And in a sense, you saw, Biden and Obama doing that by directing their deportation efforts to the border, to new arrivals, and not raiding neighborhoods and workplaces. That Trump is now changing that practice is generating a lot of backlash. And it's, you can't say it's a violation of law. That's not what the law says, but it does violate people's sense of right and wrong. And I think that Trump is going to feel that heat if he continues proceeding with these raids in significant numbers.
Well, I would love to follow up on that, but I want to make sure that I ask this final question before we say goodbye. And you have mentioned and we've discussed some of the very high profile human rights cases right now, like Gaza and immigration. I'm wondering what you think are the biggest human rights violations going on right now around the world that people, at least people in the United States, where most of our listeners will be, aren't aware of.
Yeah, look, I mean, by far and away, the biggest case that we haven't discussed yet and gets very little media attention is what's happening in Sudan, where in Sudan today, that is the world's worst humanitarian crisis. There are more displaced people there than in Ukraine and Gaza combined. And whenever you have a conflict in Africa, there's a tendency for the Western media to ignore it unless you add 2 or 3 zeros to the death toll. What in the case of Sudan, people don't really know how to resolve it. I think one particularly fruitful angle.
Well, but before you go on, because people don't really know about this case, what is in just briefly, the origin of it that makes it so hard to resolve?
Well, in Sudan, the longtime dictatorship of Omar al-Bashir was overthrown, I forget now, 3 or 4 years ago. And I guess maybe 5 years ago. And he was replaced by a military-dominated government that had a significant civilian component to it. Then the two key forces in the military split apart. One, basically the Sudanese army, the other, a paramilitary group known as the Rapid Support Forces, which 20 years ago was called the Janjaweed, which actually committed a genocide in Darfur. This is the current incarnation of that force. And so these two forces have been fighting it out with disastrous consequences for Sudanese civilians. And I think it's fair to say that the worst offender by far has been the Rapid Support Forces, which has in a sense resumed a genocide against Black African ethnic groups in Darfur. The Rapid Support Forces is more an Arab force. And the RSF is actually armed by the United Arab Emirates, which is a source of leverage. This is the way that we can make a difference, because the United Arab Emirates presents itself as a respectable, leading, wealthy Arab state. This is where Dubai is supposed to be a playground for the Middle East. This is where Emirates Airlines goes. So there are a lot of parts about the UAE that pretend to be respectable. At the same time, they are arming and underwriting this incredibly brutal genocidal force in Sudan with enormous consequences. So I think that, that is the neglected conflict. And that also suggests how it could be resolved, which is putting pressure on the United Arab Emirates to stop their arming and support for this brutal paramilitary force.
And presumably your first choice would be to follow those two tactics we talked about earlier, shaming and then finding allied governments that would put pressure on them.
Yeah, I mean, the shaming of the RSF, I don't think is terribly viable. I don't think they care that much, but they obviously need their ongoing arms supplies. So I think pressure on the UAE to stop the arms could make a big difference.
Right. I meant the way that you put pressure on the UAE was through shaming or finding allied governments.
Yes. Yes.
Well, Ken, I know you're on vacation, so thank you so much for making this time to talk with me. And I'm sure that our listeners will enjoy this as much as I did. So thanks again.
Okay. Thanks very much for having me.